Добрый день, глубоко уважаемые коллеги и гости. Сегодня 10 февраля 2022 года, 15:00 по московскому времени.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. It is 3 o'clock Moscow time. Unfortunately, because of the late arrival of the fifth member of the Station Council, we announced the first technical break.
Уважаемые коллеги, технический перерыв номер 1 закончился. Мы все в
Dear colleagues, the technical break number 1 is over. Now we're all together. So allow me to meet the Dissertation Council for the Defense of the Dissertation of Benson, Izabel, Nazikhovna for the degree of Candidate of Academic Sciences in Scientific Major 521 Economic Theory, and the topic, the impact of equality. Institution environment economic development be considered open. By the order of the Academic Secretary in Petersburg State University, dated the 1st of November 2021, number 10662/1, I, Pakomova Nadezhda Viktorovna, Doctor of Economics, Professor of the Department of Economic Theories in Petersburg State University, was appointed chairperson of the Dissertation Council. The same order appointed the members of the Dissertation Council. Let me introduce him. Dissertation Elena Mikhailovna, Doctor of Economics, Professor, Department of Economic Theory and Economic Policy, St. Petersburg State University. In the remote access mode, the meeting of the Dissertation Council is attended by Lapinkas Arinas Algarovich, Doctor of Economics, Professor of the Department of Economic Theory of St. Petersburg Mining University. Salishveta Alexeyevna, Doctor of Economics, Professor of the Department of General Economic Theory and History of Economic Thought, St. Petersburg State University of Economics. I suppose that everybody sees and hears. Lemeshenko Professor Gavit, the Doctor of Economics, Professor, Head of the Department of International Political Economy of the State University of Belarus. The applicant is also present with us, Benson, Izabel, Nazikhovna. Also the scientific advisor, Doctor of Economic Sciences, Professor of the Department of Economic Theory, Economic Policy of St. Petersburg State University, Lyakin Alexander Nikolaevich. Dear colleagues, in order to improve the quality of communication, I would like to ask you, dear colleagues, all those who are in the remote access mode, to turn off your microphones. I would also like to say that audio and video recording is being carried out, and there is live broadcast in St. Petersburg State University. Speeches are being simultaneously translated from Russian to English and English into Russian. On the screen of the live broadcast of the meeting, the email is currently indicated, and the address of which during the meeting all students can send questions to the applicant to express their opinion directly related to the content of the dissertation and the speech of the applicant. The current scientific discussion, and thus take part in the scientific discussion. The questions will be sent to me by our technical service. I'll consider them, and they are to be related to the presentation by the applicant and the content of the thesis. It's necessary to indicate to the topic. All those questions not related to that will not be voiced. According to the procedure of awarding the degree of Candidate of the Science and the Doctor of Science at Petersburg City University, the meeting of the Dissertation Council is considered competent if at least 2/3 of the approved members take part in the Dissertation Council, but no less than 4 people. Our Dissertation Council consists of 5 people. All 5 are present, including 3 council members in remote interactive mode. Audiovisual contact is provided with them. Thus, there is a quorum. I'd like the member of the department to issue the turnout list. I established the following rules of today's meeting of the Dissertation Council. The total duration is about 2 hours. Brief information about the applicant and the documents submitted for the degree, their compliance with the requirements. Answers to possible questions, approximately 5 minutes. 2. Short report by the applicant, reflecting the main provisions of the research, about 15 minutes. Questions to the applicant, strictly according to the report, no more than 2 minutes per question. Applicant's answers, no more than 5 minutes for everything. Announcement of external reviews, if any. 6. Speech by all members of the Decision Council in turn, with the assessment of the thesis and the performance of the applicant, as well as with questions and suggestions to the applicant. Approximately 10 minutes per speaker. 7. Presentation by the chairman with the assessment of the thesis, approximately 10 minutes. Answers of the applicant for scientific degree to questions and comments of members of the Decision Council, no more than 20 minutes. Now, open discussion. Speeches at the request of those present at the defense, with a summary of their positions and or with specific questions and proposals for the thesis, strictly on the topic of the research, no more than 2 minutes per participant. We ask all those willing to take the floor to fill the information in the turnout list and introduce themselves with their full name, academic title, position and place of work. Next, the presentation about the chairperson of questions addressed to the applicant received during the discussion in the process of scientific discussion during the live broadcast of the meeting via St. Petersburg University website. I'd like to draw attention to the fact that the written questions, the announcement of which takes more than 2 minutes, will not be voiced. Applicants' answers no more than 2 minutes per question. Speech by the supervisor of the applicant, no more than 3 minutes. Discussion by members of the Decision Council before an open vote on the results of the defense, during which the sound of the broadcast is turned off. And it takes approximately 5 minutes. Then an open roll call, counting of votes, with the subsequent entry of the results in the minutes of the meeting. Next, making decision on awarding or not awarding academic degree. And finally, close the remarks of the applicant, no more than 2 minutes. Dear colleagues, are there any questions or objections to the regulation? If there are no objections, I'll move to implementing the rules of the meeting. First of all, turn off the sound of the mobile phones. Dear colleagues from the Decision Council who are in the remote access mode, I would ask you not to turn off the phone for prompt communication in case of technical failure. Thank you very much for your understanding. So I'm starting the meeting. So first, a brief report. The thesis of Benson, Izabel, Nazikhovna for the degree of candidate of economic sciences and scientific specialty 521, the economic theory in the topic, the impact of the quality of the institutional environment, economic development, was expected for defense by the order of the academic secretary of St. Petersburg State University on the 9th of September 2021, number 8635/1. Benson, Izabel, Nazikhovna wrote the thesis on the basis of St. Petersburg State University in the status of graduate student. Her scientific advisor is Lakin Alexander Nikolaevich, professor of Department of Economic Theory and Economic Policy. The number of publications are 3. In peer-reviewed scientific publications from the list approved by the Ministry of Education and Science, 2 publications. In those indexed by the Scientific Database Web of Scopus, 1 publication. According to the information that I have received from the curator, all the documents correspond to the requirements. Their copies are available with the Officer of the Department of the Provision of the Dissertation Councils, who is now present on the meeting. Prior to giving the floor to the applicant, I have a question to the members of the Dissertation Council. is there a need to announce the entire list of documents? There is no need, so we move to the next step, the applicant's brief report. I remind you that the time limit is 15 minutes. Dear Chairperson of the Decision Council, dear members of the Decision Council, let me present to your attention the thesis on the topic, the impact of the quality of the institutional environment on economic development. The relevance of the chosen topic is due to the problems of Russian economic growth, the need to find ways out of stagnation, addressing issues of institutional inertia. The purpose of the work is theoretical substantiation and assessment of the impact of the quality of institution, economic development and welfare. The objectives are presented in the slide. Let us consider further the most important results of the thesis submitted for defense. Based on the study and understanding of the most well-known theories explaining institutional differences, I understood that the theory of institutional matrices, open and closed access orders, a type, inclusive and extractive institution, together explain the same phenomenon, that of the stability of institutional environment in case of change. Institutions change based on the influence of non-formal institutions. The obtained conclusion make it possible to choose the methodology for further research based on the theory of institutional matrices. It's worth noting that the stability of institutions does not mean that they are not prone to changes. The change is viewed through the idea of stimuli, with the main role based to legitimate aspect of the property. When the elite is interested in creating the respective mechanism of avoiding the redistribution of property. Based on the theory, I classified the qualities of institutional environment characteristic of Russian, understanding that these characteristics will be applicable to other economies, such as dual approach, fragmentariness, the emergence of quasi-institutions. All of them taken together show the weakness of a legitimate system and do not yield the growth of economy. I had to determine the qualitative type of institution based on indices and ratings that appraise the institutions and compare the countries. In this slide, you can see 5 indices that have a common nucleus. These indices evaluate similar parameters, and the reliability of information received with the help of the poll is usually applicable. My hypothesis is, if it is possible to identify 2 indices which use the different methods of assembling information and appraise different parameters, and if the information in the indices correlates, then we might conclude that the results of the rating polls are trustworthy. In the graph, you can see lines which show the dependence of the results, and the arrows show the links. We can see that the easiness of doing business and governance matters are not linked together. some use different types of methods. Correlation analysis shows that they show closeness of the links. Thus, the information obtained is trustworthy, and the appraisal of certain parameters demonstrates the quality of the institution as the whole. Thus, the further study is based on the indices showing the quality of governance. Regression model demonstrating the level of the quality depending on the institution. We see that the dependence is not linear, but it is direct. So increase of 1 point results in GDP growth up to 1.8%. And more than 80% of differences account for institutions. Thus, we can make conclusions about the economic situation in Russia. The analysis of the growth rates based on the indicators of quality institutions show that cluster analysis is also necessary to put the countries into the groups that might be interpreted. Countries in clusters 2 and 3 have lower rates of institutions. These countries are characterized by higher and more varied rates of economic growth. And countries in the 4th and 5th clusters with effective institutions demonstrate lower results, but nevertheless stable growth rates. The difference in the rate of economic growth show that the institutions act differently in the long-term and short-term rate. Thus, in the short term, it's possible to achieve high growth rates with poor institutions. But in the long term, the quality of institution ensures the high growth rates. The economic growth in the condition of resource abundance is a relevant aspect for the Russian economy. The hypothesis of the paradox or resource curse is that the resource wealth with the institutions maintains acceptable standard of living for the population. And inefficient institutions are conserved, and the country sacrifices economic growth and development. To find additional arguments in favor of the hypothesis, the countries were divided into 7 clusters according to the principle of similarity of GDP per capita and the absence or presence of resource rent or all rent. We can see that the countries with all reserve have a lower quality of institutions. In the same way, countries with similar GDP level show a lower rate of institutions. Thus, resources might be one cause of the decreasing quality of institutions. In order to consider the institutional environment, many sacrifice the institution in favor of the rent. Such countries as Norway, for example, not included in the slide, do not have any traits of the paradox of abundance, since the reserves were found after the strong institutions had been formed. The questions of the evolution of institution under external influence is rather important. I analyzed the rot effect. Unlike previously, the institution exported but deformed. The slide presents the data. Former USSR republics that became part or did not become part of the European Union. We can observe that Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia demonstrate positive dynamics and improve the institutions, the quality of the institutions. Thus, we can say that the countries of exporters of institutions control their quality. At the same time, we can see that the cluster formed by Uzbekistan, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia and Kazakhstan is moving within the road, within the cluster itself. The institutionalized environment is deformed. And the countries do not pass the border level of the quality of institutions. It can be concluded that the evolution of institutions is possible thanks to the outside influence. Countries which are subject to external control or influence have lower rate of falling into the pattern of a rut. The differences in the wealth of the countries are mostly determined by the differences of the institutional organization. The higher the institutional environment, the higher the economic state. Countries with high quality institutions are less dependent on the market economy. Countries exporting oil should change the funds from exports, but rather need to focus on the improvement of the welfare of the citizens. Thank you for your attention. Dear colleagues, are there any questions to the applicant based on the presentation, based on the report? Have no more than 2 minutes, please. Dear colleagues, I would like to ask the question, please. The idea of property was greatly changed within the reform of the 19 years. Can we talk about the basic traits of institutional area? Tamara Alexeyevna, thank you very much. Yes, this relationship was changed, but we can see that there is now the such a trait of improving the role of the state in the economy. State industry provide 50% of jobs, and there are about 20% of state property in the whole pool of property. Thus, institutions that are characteristic for ex-matrices still remain in the economy. I have one more question, dear Chairperson, if it's possible to ask it as well. The thesis says that the efficiency of institutions can be seen through the dynamics of the increase of economics and the welfare of the citizen. China has been demonstrating growth during the increase of the welfare of the population. Doesn't it pose your thesis about the less efficiency of institutional system based on ex-matrice under question? Thank you very much for the interesting question. As for China, what China achieved within 3 decades was the road from agricultural country to industrial country. The resource base was significant. Thus, small-scale changes look large-scale. Then we can see that China is gradually integrating Y-matrices institutions. For example, we can take the liberalization of prices. The analysis of sub-indices shows that the efficiency of the government in China is positively appraised since governing is achieved at high level. Thus, X matrix uses the institutions from Y matrix. I have one more question. As a follow-up to the question by Tamara Alexeyevna, I had a similar question, formulated a little bit differently. Could you please say, how do low-level institutions influence the investment climate? So that's another contradiction. Saudi Arabia, for example, where administrative institutions exist at a certain level, as we well know. Nevertheless, it has the strongest and the largest oil extracting company is Saudi Aramco, which forms the top 10 of oil extracting companies, which shows that the level of investment attractiveness is very high. So there is a paradox. So how do bad institutions, low-quality institutions, influence the investment climate based on the example of Saudi Arabia? Thank you very much for the question. It is extremely interesting. And I should take into account that Saudi Arabia, strange as it may seem, has good institutions. I had a look at the dynamics of the sub-indices of government institution, apart from two criteria. Thus, Saudi Arabia has created strong institutions which can redistribute financial resources obtained from the sales of the raw materials. The basis of the development of economy is the protection of property rights. In accordance to the World Bank, the protection of property rights in Saudi Arabia is performed at a high level. I'm not sure about the exact position of I got mixed up a little bit. Could I ask you a clarifying question? You meant United Arab Emirates? No, I meant Saudi Arabia, based on the example of Saudi Aramco. Although pretty much the same question based on the Arab Emirates. Well, I understand the principles of your answer. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the answer. That will be fine. One more question, please. About the very, very beginning. About the scientific novelty. I agree that scientific novelty is present. The question is, point 2 of the scientific novelty. And you say that the key institution providing the evolution of institutional system is the institution of property. Legitimate property is the basis for investment. My question is, so what is new about it? What is novel about this thesis? Since this thesis that the key institution is the property right is a very common thesis. Dear colleagues, we have 2 more minutes for questions. You understood the question, didn't you? The idea of novelty is linked to the fact that I analyzed different theories according to which the changes are difficult to achieve. The second theory analyzes the evolution of theories. And it showed me the institution of the rights, of the property rights, is the key in the evolution of the institutions. Colleagues, are there any more questions? Dear Izabel Nazikhovna, your main theoretical prerequisite are the two groups of institutions, X and Y matrices. In my opinion, this is a methodological prerequisite. There haven't been such situations where non-market institution existed. For 2,000 years, market institutions have been evolutionizing. What is your idea? Well, I support your thesis and the work that you did. What is your attitude towards this prerequisite? The theory of matrices provides a good basis for the analysis, since the theory was based on the question why some countries experience one way of evolution and other countries experience a different way. And this theory was used as a basis. But there is one drawback. It does not answer to the question, how do institutions evolutionize? Although the theory is very convenient for analysis and to serve as a basis of the research, it was viewed together with other theories and ideas. The ideas of Svetlana Gennadievna provided us with high quality analysis. Nevertheless, the above-mentioned theory had certain flaws that had to be resolved. Very briefly, one more question. In your text, you always say about the problems. Is there a direct link, is there a direct correlation that the wealthier countries are wealthier in natural reserves, have lower quality institutions, and those countries which do not have reserves, natural reserves, have stronger institutions? Is there such a correlation? There is no direct correlation. That's why there is a paradox. Thus, additional arguments were such as Norway and Canada. They don't have this paradox. If we talk about the countries with inefficient institutions, then the elites work specifically on the improvement institutions, so to extract the rent for them personally. Thus, the countries with lower quality institutions, we can see only the deterioration. And if we analyze GDP level and take the countries with the same wealth, we can see that the institutions in oil-rich countries are considered of lower quality. I have a question as well. I have two questions. The first question is related to Russia. Which institutions, formal or non-formal, have a stronger influence on economic development and economic growth? Traditions, patriarchal approach, the Christianity ideas, church traditions, aren't these the causes for our inability to get out of the trap of the middle level of development? Nadezhda Viktorovna, thank you very much for the very interesting question. I think that non-formal institutions have a stronger influence since they are deformed within the influence of the non-formal rules, which is demonstrated by the analysis that show the weaknesses and deterioration from other economies. In your presentation, there was a comparative analysis of institutions of Baltic regions by the end of the presentation. My question is about Baltic region, especially about Latvia and Lithuania. Are the factors taken into account when considering the dynamics of the welfare, were the external factors taken into account? I know that there were significant financial resources put into the green industries. Maybe that's not about the quality of institutions, since this growth is accompanied by high level of unemployment. And there is a loss of population, thus employment potential is basically undermined. Maybe it's not enough to take into consideration only the factors that you have taken into consideration in the relevant indices. Thank you very much for the question. I'd like to say that the history of each country requires targeted analysis. And in my research, I analyzed each country, all the countries in general, without being too specific. In here, we can see the index of the quality of governance. Lithuania and Latvia are typical for X-matrix cooperation, and now the stumbling block is a certain rot in the development. Nevertheless, European Council as integration group controls the quality and does not allow the countries to develop based on their previous experience. Thank you very much. Well, dear colleagues, we have exhausted the limit of this type of procedure. So we move to the next point, that is, we're going to voice the reviews of the members of the Dissertation Council. The question is, how are you going to answer the reviews? Would you like to provide answer after every review? Okay, so agreed. In accordance to the procedure, you will provide response after each of the review is voiced. As for external reviews, none were received. So we move to the members of the Decision Council. Since all the reviews were published on St. Petersburg University website, I would ask my colleagues to voice only the key issues and the questions to the applicant. Are there any disagreements? No. So we'll proceed then. We'll begin with Selisheva Tamara Alexeyevna, Lapinskas, Lemeshenko Piotr, Korostishevskaya Yelena, and then I. And I give the floor to Tamara Alexeyevna. Dear colleagues, dear Chairperson of the Dissertation Council, first of all, I'd like to thank you for your trust in me and for inviting me to take part in the work of the Council. The thesis was very interesting. Well, since there is no need to voice the key aspects, institutional research is the problem of key importance. The influence on the quality of life, and especially a very difficult problem, the quantitative analysis of the influence of institution on the economic growth as a whole. As for novelty, I would say that they correspond to the requirements of the thesis, and I would point out that the analysis of the existing institutional concepts, inclusive and extractive institutions of X and Y, institutional matrices, could lead to the conclusion that the use of the theory of the institutional matrices provides the opportunity to determine the factors of sustainability of the institutional environment, even in case of a non-optimal environment of the development. The next point. Based on the hypothesis and the usage of the cluster analysis, the conclusion about the economic integration influencing the institutional environment in the member states. Page 110-113. Next, the comparative analysis of the methodology of international indices allowed to demonstrate that there is possibility of using them to characterize a specific institution. Correlation has been established between different parameters of indices. Their core has been identified, which allowed to determine to carry out the qualitative assessment of the quality of institutional environment. Also, the quantitative correlation between the quality of institutional environment based on the integral index of the quality and the level of the welfare in the society. And this is a very important aspect. I would like to say that previously, although there were such attempts to prove that in the long-term period, the difference of GDP per capita are characterized by different quality of the existing institutions. The thesis corresponds to the requirements of a state university and to the major 521. The results put for defense provide detailed information about the importance of institutional factors and can be used for further studies of the input of the qualitative characteristics of institutional environment in the economic growth. All the provisions for defense, conclusions and recommendations are well grounded. There are certain issues to be discussed based on the content of the thesis. The first question is that the work does not fully explain the link between the quality of institutions and quantitative estimations of the quality of institutional environment. The presence of a link does not give information on the correlation. The countries with high economic growth level might spend additional funds on the improvement of quality of institution. Wealthy countries find it relatively cheap to pay for institutions. Thus, it's possible for them to provide good quality service on behalf of the state. Thus, the author has not only to prove the link, but also the direction of this link. That's kind of a proposal. The author faces a contradiction when saying that being a part of integration groups is one of the factors that promotes the evolution of a level of institutions based on the Baltic countries. Nevertheless, when comparing it with the theory of institutional matrices, we remember that Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia are the countries with the historically established Y matrices institutions. But after the Second World War, under the economic and political pressure of USSR, they manifested themselves as countries with the dominant X institution. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, X matrices were rejected. Obviously, it is also applicable to the Czech Republic, Hungary, and other countries. And the larger number of the institutions typical for Y matrices in the countries that within the 2 centuries were developing within the framework of the Russian power are questionable. Third, it is necessary to provide further proof that the institutions with economies with Y matrices and more efficient with economies with X matrices. Take, for example, the institution of planning, which emerged in the economy of USSR, which the author refers to X matrix. After the Second World War, France, which is viewed by the author as the country of Y matrix, used this institution to develop its economy. How is it possible to explain how the Soviet Union, which belongs to X matrix, could carry out successful industrialization in the 1930s and become one of the leaders of the fourth technological state? And at the same time, modern China, belonging to X matrix, built socialism and demonstrate high rates of growth and the improvement of welfare of the population. And the fourth issue, take into account the digital transformation of the economy and the indices of electronic government, e-government index, World Digital Competitiveness Ranking, MD, and others. The majority of my remarks are rather proposals. The work itself, the thesis itself, is of high quality, and my remarks do not undermine the quality of the thesis. The results are reliable, and my questions might be viewed as a scientific discussion based on the topic. The thesis of Benson, Izabel, Nazikhovna is an independent research paper which provides trustworthy, well-grounded scientific results. The content, the results, and the conclusion of the thesis are well-grounded. And the thesis, Impact of the Institutional Environment, Quality and Economic Development, corresponds to the requirements set by the Order of 1911-2021 on awarding scientific degrees at Budapest State University. And the author, Benson Izabel Nazikhovna, deserves being awarded the scientific degree of Candidate of Economic Sciences, Major 521, Economic Theory. Thank you. Thank you, Tamara Alexeyevna. Tamara Alexeyevna, thank you very much. I cannot but agree with you that I should have provided a full explanation of the link between institutions and the well-being. In here, I used Douglas North conclusions and works by Russian authors such as Alexashenko. They conducted similar research where they proved that institutions are the key source of differences in the level of well-being and the rate of economic growth. As for the predominance of institutions of various matrices, I do not disagree that Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were the economies with a Y matrices prevailing. But we can see that Lithuania and Latvia met the problem of X institutions and the loss of effectiveness, which I touched upon in the questions. As for the Czech Republic and Hungary, since the countries are member states of the EU, this doesn't allow them their institutions to deteriorate. If we construct the same graphs for all the countries of the European Union, we can see that Hungary shows the deterioration of the index. In 2006, the index was 0.95, but in 2019, it was 0.42. However, despite the downward dynamics, the influence of the European Union doesn't allow to the country to cross the threshold. Why economies are more efficient, functioning more efficiently in case of the market economy? But the institutions, according to Curtin, institutions of matrices allow markets of Y economy to solve the tasks that are difficult to achieve in conditional market relations. Well, obviously, France used such an approach in order to combat the economic problems. As for the USSR, I conducted additional analysis, and I identified that the institutions functioned at a higher quality level. In the first part, I demonstrated that legislative institutions are a key part of development. For example, judicial system in the USSR was independent, corruption was limited. Because of the inability of punishment. Thus, the USSR was able to provide industrialization in the situation when it had rather efficient institutions. It's difficult for me to talk about the digitalization because it's necessary to conduct separate work on the digitalization of each particular economy. We give the floor to Lapinskas. Should I voice only the remarks or the entire review? Well, you can make it as short as possible. There is no need to read out the entire review. I'd like to say that it was a great pleasure for me to look through the thesis, since I work at the mining institution, and it's very pleasant for me to review the thesis on economic theory. And I'd like to say that I liked the thesis. Russia cannot get out of this vicious circle. Many countries have a different approach to the resource curse. Some believe that it is non-existent, but I don't agree. The thesis is highly interesting. And the theory of institutional matrices allowed to have a different view on this theory. Well, different parts of the thesis appealed to me different ways. But I like the first chapter. Dislike the first chapter because certain contradictions emerge. And the idea of institutional matrices emerged from sociology, but it's not a problem, and we can use it in the economic theory. And this approach is highly interesting. And the correlation, the cluster analysis used by the applicant appealed to me. The second chapter was fine as well, although there were certain drawbacks. The thesis itself is of good quality, and my assessment is positive. Now, as to my remarks. The author says that the institutional characteristics of Russia are impediment for economic growth, but the work lacks the institutional hindrances, and it doesn't talk about the measures of improving the institutional area. Thus, it is impossible to understand whether it is possible to carry out the institutional policies. And there is no clear explanation of the link between the institutional matrix, and the political system. The second remark. The thesis pays a lot of attention to the concept of institutional matrices. And if there is a process of evolution of institutional systems, then at different stages of development, different elements should get into each of the matrix. And the first chapter sees the abundance of sociology terms. The author provides additional arguments in favor of the concept of resource curse or the paradox of abundance, demonstrating that the existence of resources does not allow to increase the growth rate, and the welfare potential is lower than that possible. But the thesis does not analyze another idea, that is, if the resource abundance provide a higher level of welfare than in the countries with the same quality institutions, but with scarce natural reserves. And as for the decrease in the economic growth, considering the countries with abundant resources. The fourth remark. Inclusive political institutions are extremely important for innovative approach. And they are predominant in such countries as China and United Arab Emirates, and I have already asked about it, and United Arab Emirates with X matrices, which has this paradox of plenty, of abundance. There are certain typos. There are few of them, there are several of them. But my overall conclusion is that the thesis is of good quality, and the positive aspects are much higher than the negative aspects. And it corresponds to the requirements of the Order of 1911-2021, number 11181/1. And I believe that Benson, Izabel, and Nazikhovna deserves being awarded the scientific degree of the candidate of Economic Sciences, Major 521, Economic Theory. Thank you very much for getting to know the presentation. I would like to comment them. If we talk about the limitation, I talked about the incentive motives of the elites, and identified that if institutional systems do not perfect themselves, then they become rent-oriented. Thus, certain groups of the society get either resource or other type of rent. The principle of the implementation of the right, enforcement of the right, work. And if the rights are enforced, disregarding the social status, then this is a driver of decrease. If we talk about Kirchner theory, although it was overused, I do believe that it is very, it's highly applicable. It does not contradict other theories. As for the import of institutions from X matrices to Y matrices, I'd like to repeat once more that during the times of crisis, the institution from X matrix proved to be very useful to countries with Y economy. Well, Take, for example, the New Deal by President Roosevelt, during which X matrix institutions were imported into Y economy to overcome the depression. As for the curse of plenty, the level of the welfare was higher. In spite of improving the national welfare based on the institutions, they are dealt by redistributing the wealth from oil exports. This way, the evolution of institution is hampered, and the lack of stimuli results in the slower growth rate of the economy. On the innovative, if oil is sold by country, then the money is distributed among all the members of the country more or less equally, which transfers the resource base into the development of economy. Such countries as China and United Arab Emirates demonstrate gradual improvement of the quality of institutions. United Arab Emirates, for example, they have a positive estimation of the work of institution. As for China, it's not yet. And I certainly agree with the comments on the typos. I'd like to give the floor to Lemeshenko Piotr Sergeyevich, please. Dear Chairperson, dear members of the Dissertation Council, good afternoon once again. It was a great pleasure for me Well, it's very similar to the work that I faced in 1991 when our department changed its name because of the problems that we faced. It was not clear how the new institutions were being formed. Since economic development of Russia in particular is based not only on the existence of resource base, but the parameters of the quality of institutional environment, according to the author, and this is absolutely just. When addressing the improvement of the quality of institutions, it's necessary to pay attention to the key aspects of the modern day development. Well, of course, the problem of the quality of institutions and the improvement of the system is viewed in such a way. Why is the country not developing? Well, institutions are bad. Well, the process is ongoing process for real development and for the development of the theory. Even 1 decade is not enough. And the thesis itself addresses the system. It provides the systemic analysis of different institutions, which is a very positive side. Unlike other theses of a similar topic, the difference in using different methods of obtaining information provide the results which do not contradict each other and provide the rating of countries. Based on the comparative analysis of methodologies and usage of indices. The author limits the indices based on the general statistical base and general methodology. The applicant paid attention to the fact that certain aspects require attention, because if we look at indices in different systems, we don't understand which methodological base they rely on. Another positive aspect of the work is the analysis of the qualities and the rod effect, not only in our scientific sphere, but abroad as well. Very few people answer the question why one country chooses another mode of path dependence and other countries take a different path of dependence. But within the framework of the thesis, it was difficult to perform, but nevertheless, which questions might be asked? Maybe it would be necessary to distinguish the economic growth and economic development, because growth might be different from development, because growth might create the potential for the development. The author should understand the boundaries of changes within the framework of the evolution of the institutional system. Within the framework of institutional metrics, it's possible to use different types of institutions which do not belong to the same metrics. Moreover, the import of institutions can provide successive improvement of the quality of institutional system. At the same time, the presence of dominant institutions leads to the deformation of the institution and the loss of their qualities. The changes of dominant institution are linked to the change in the government. 3. The author says that economics, which had the institutional systems determined by X matrices, are inferior to Y economies. And the shift from one system to another seems to be impossible. But then the question arises, why within the historical development these inefficient institutional structures emerged? And if they exist simultaneously, doesn't it show that there is a gap between two groups of economies? I asked the question about these matrices. Should we deal with these matrices as proven theory and practice? I would like to say that these are mostly sociological works which were cited by the author, but there are more ecological, economic works. As for the direct correlation of institutional environment through different indices and the level of well-being, and such correlation is not linked to the cause and effect relationship. It does not mean causation. So the good quality of the institutions leads to the high level of well-being, or high level of development allows to use the resources to create good institutions. If we talk about the fifth question, if we talk about the protection of the property rights, the applicant should have used this procedure when talking about the rights of personality and freedoms. and 80% of employment of labor remained without theory or practice. You can use the works by Piketty and Stiglitz to talk about this aspect. And 6, there are certain misprints. Well, this is typical for all applicants usually and graduates. Nevertheless, I'd like to say that the thesis created a very positive perception. The practical material demonstrate the hypothesis. Conclusions are well grounded. Thus, the thesis by Benson, Izabel, and Nazikhovna on the above-mentioned topic corresponds to the major 521 economic theory and is an important research paper which has an impact on the theoretical development of the topic. It corresponds to the requirements stated in the Order 1911-2021. And Benson, Izabel, and Nazikhovna deserves being awarded the scientific degree of the candidate of economic sciences, major 521. Thank you very much. Piotr Sergeyevich, thank you very much. As for the distinction between the growth and development, I'd like to say that economic growth is easier to be estimated because to be assessed. We need to measure the growth in terms of GDP or GDP per capita. Economic development is a broader concept, and it encompasses qualitative changes as well as changes in the distribution of goods produced. It has qualitative indices, such as human development indices. And sometimes this correlation emerges because of the methodology. We used economic growth as the index to measure the institutional environment, or otherwise we wouldn't have received clear results. If we talk about the borders of other estimations, which are absolutely clear, it's not very straightforward. If we take Japan, for example, if a country starts borrowing institutions, it will deform or reform social institutions. Why didn't it yield the destruction? Why? Because the country was in crisis and the reform faced the public demand for different institutions. Thus, the example of Japan is a good example of the change of the basis metrics. As for the efficiency of economies, according to Svetlana Kirdina, X-matrix economies were efficient during non-communal environment. The factors of production were difficult to identify, and the property was joint, and the countries evolved based on these aspects. Now all function in market economy, and X institutions seem to be inefficient. Thus, we use the qualitative analysis of indexes because countries did not show the positive work of the institutions. As for causal relationship, I relied on the ideas by Akizinova, Alexashenko, and other authors. and I point upon them in the second chapter. As for the use of natural resources, I believe that since natural resources are finite, they need to be transformed into the long-term economic development potential. As for the property protection rights, the invaluable or existing indices take into account such aspects as the implementation of the rule of law and legitimacy of the judicial system. Thus, basic rights of the person are protected. Thank you. We give the word to Dissertation, Yelena Mikhailovna. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be at this Dissertation Council. I would like to point out that the work is novel and highly interesting. Russia is in dire need of different institutions. The ideas formulated in the thesis are well grounded. As for the novelty, the opportunity for institutional changes is proved through the gradual development of institution. The institutions can work under the external influence. The author provides the classification of institutional environment and gives specific characteristics of institution. The thesis states that it's possible to retain the basic characteristics pertaining to the institutional matrices. The key role of the institutions is regarded in depth, as well as the evolution of the institutional system. The work also talks about the applicability of the indices to appraise the quality of the institutions as a whole. The quality of the institution is proved to influence the economic growth rate in short-term and long-term periods. In short-term period, it's possible to achieve high levels of growth despite bad institutions. But in long-term perspective, the higher rate of development and growth is provided only by the high quality of institution. In long-term perspective, there is direct correlation between GDP per capita and institutional environment. The country's oil exporters and gas exporters, GDP per capita increases not at the same pace as could be achieved in case of a better quality of institutions. The thesis is of high quality with ideas about the solution to the current economic problem. The theoretical and practical importance are high. The results of the research and the attitude of the author can be used for further consideration of the impact of institutional environment on the economic. And it is practically applicable because it deals with the improvement of institutional environment within the framework of social development. Nevertheless, there are certain controversial issues. Page 37, the author wrote the following, quote, explicit example of the weakness of the judicial system is the category of litigation between the citizens and the governmental bodies. As is often the case, the citizens will receive their litigation orders rejected. since the procedure is supervised by special code. And it's necessary to identify what the author meant when the author wrote about the rejection of the claim. On page 131, the profit from the export of reserves is enough to support non-efficient institutions, but is not enough to provide the high level of well-being. In this respect, it's necessary to specify how are non-efficient institutions being supported. And finally, the thesis has logical conclusions on the necessity to move the Russian economy from X matrix to Y matrix as a logical stage of the evolution of institutions. Nevertheless, the author proves that the stability of institutional matrices preserves the key characteristics of the institutional environment. Despite certain changes, the input of new institutions, evolution of reforms, and so on. Then I have a question. Is it possible to have such transition, especially if we take into account the specific ideas about the resources? I would like to say that this is a very interesting research, since it posed the question and identified the key issues that require further research. And I believe that the thesis and I agree that the applicant, Benson, Izabel, and Nazikhovna, deserves being awarded the scientific degree of Candidate of Economic Sciences, Major 521, Economic Theory, points 9 to 11. And the points 9 to 11 were not violated. Yelena Mikhailovna, thank you very much for your review. As for the guaranteed rejection and refusal in litigation, well, the term is not entirely correct and it has certain emotional connotation. If we talk about arbitrary disputes, then we don't see the discrimination of certain people. But if we talk about litigation with the state authorities, if we talk about the disputes with executive bodies, 77% of statements are not accepted and 45% are declined. Thus, if we consider the litigation with the state at all levels, then more than 50 claims are rejected, and 30% of decisions are refusals. If we talk about the institutions which have or do not have the rent, then we can see that there is a higher level of well-being in the countries with the oil reserves, since certain social aspects can be financed this way. And the strategy of the deterioration of the quality of institution is performed to redistribute the oil rent in the favor of the institution. I have talked about Japan as an example. I can talk about Singapore, which faced the necessity to transform the institution, and the poor country became a rather rich country thanks to the Thus, we can see the transformation of institution and redistribution of interests. Thank you, colleagues. Now I'd like to express my opinion. Since much has already been was mentioned, I'll try to be rather concise and talk about only the issues or questions or difficulties that haven't been touched upon. Well, the relevance of the topic is quite clear. Even the number of questions, remarks, and topics for discussions prove the position of the applicant is very clear. You talk about the economic theory, institutional evolutionary theory. As for the importance of the results achieved, I'm the graduate of economic cybernetics, and it's very pleasant for me to look at the professional use of processing of great information data. But at first I thought that the topic was very broad. And the conclusions are well grounded. The results yielded correspond to the aims and goals. I'm not going to ask you about X and Y matrices and their links. The author talks about the social responsibility of corporations. What are the risks in terms of cooperative responsibility? And I would like to have a more specific and more detailed answers. And these questions are highly discussed recently. Well, of course, the work was written before this issue became one of the key ones. Another aspect is the aspect of the efficiency of the transfer of institutions. The applicant has a certain controversial points. certain parts of the thesis say that the formal institution change as a result of the influence of non-formal institutions. And later on that the author says that this can be used only in a more rigid environment. You talk about the environment for efficient transfer of institution. You talk about integrational processes of the countries. The integration processes are the guarantee of the efficiency of institution. Could you be more specific? Nevertheless, all my remarks do not serve as the significant drawback of the thesis. The results obtained are of high qualities and can be of high practical use. The structure corresponds to the aims and targets, and the main provision for defense can be found in the published articles and were voiced at conferences. The thesis corresponds to the requirements of the order of the 9/11/2021 11181/1, and the applicant Benson, Izabel, Nazikhovna deserves being awarded the scientific degree of economic sciences, major 521 economic theory. Points 9 and 11 of the above-mentioned order were not violated. Thank you. Nadezhda Viktorovna, thank you very much for your review. I would like to point out the following aspects. The topic of the social responsibility of corporations was not fully developed. But I have already answered that question when we discussed the idea of human capital and the protection of basic rights. It's impossible to get sustainable economic development or without creation of human capital. Discussing the issues of transformation of institutions, it's necessary to pay attention to the idea that integration groups are not the only way to counteract the dependence path. Such countries as Japan showed that importing institutions wisely can change one dominant matrix to different metrics. And at the same time, if the country is importing a Y matrix institution, but the dominant X metrics remain unchanged, then the system will move back. Thus, partially importing institutions is inefficient. So the only way is gradual transformation, and critical moments serve as the best points. Crises, for example, where the development of all the areas are necessary for the survival of the system. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, the members of the Dissertation Council, do you have any more additional questions? Do you have any need to clarify some of the aspects, or was everything clear? Yes, I suppose that everything is enough. As for those willing to participate from the audience, there is none. Now the external feedback. No, we didn't receive any questions via the remote access mode, and so I'll like to give the floor to the scientific advisor. esteemed colleagues, which is not very characteristic for the scientific advisor. First of all, I'd like to thank you that in this harsh situation, the members assembled, and this is difficult taking into account the situation we're currently in. My task is not to comment about the thesis. Well, of course, I'm jointly responsible for it. My task is to give the description or characteristics of the work by the applicant. First, the choice of the topic of the research and why this research topic was chosen. First of all, we were trying to work on the advantages that we have. Izabel is a mathematician, so we wanted to get more important ideas. It was necessary to put together the Marxist approach and the institutional approach. The Marxist approach to the production relationship, which either halt or promote development. If in accordance with the Marxist approach, we talk about the quality within the framework of one production, and the transition means a change of the type of production. Institutional theory gives a more flexible approach to the multitude of institutions. And Kurdina's approach, despite all the sociological specification, is the approach which views institutions as a system which can evolutionize. The second aspect is the quantitative estimation of the reliability of the information and the attempt to understand how the changes of the characteristics promotes the changes in the institutions. Izabel is a researcher, is an independent researcher, but it took us almost 5 years to work on the research. Mostly the work was done during the undergraduate year, the graduate year, then it was concluded after the graduation. And I would like to say that Izabel, as a researcher, is a fully formed researcher. She's capable to formulate hypotheses and search for the ways to test the hypothesis. Her previous undergrad student years, that's the ebook of the former postgraduate students, that was work in the face-to-face modes and seminars. And Izabel participated quite actively in the youth science in the faculty, in the development of the youth science. And I believe that Izabel published her article in St. Petersburg State University Vestnik, and we know that this is a very strict procedure of being independently evaluated and blind review of 2 reviewers. And finally, the article was accepted. And I believe that this journal is a key one on economic problems. Finally, characterizing the work by Izabel, I'd like to say that it was a pleasure for me to work with her. And I would like her to consider the idea of continuing her career at university. It's a pity when we have people who are capable of working in the scientific sphere, but who prefer higher salary, which is understandable, quicker career growth perspectives. But I would like Izabel to regard the work at a university as a possibility. Once again, I'd like to thank the Council for today's meeting. Dear colleagues, are there any more options to participate? No? Then we finish the discussion. Prior to the final vote, I'd like to ask the members of the Dissertation Council. Do the members of the Dissertation Council have any questions or remarks considering the procedure, including the remote access mode? No remarks, no objections. So all the colleagues in the remote access modes confirm that there are no objections or remarks. Thank you, colleagues. Then we move to the next point. We move into the final vote. Is it necessary to announce the break to discuss the results of the defense?
Ну, наверное, нет необходимости.
I suppose that there is no need to announce the break. Is everybody ready? Since there is no need to announce the break, then we are not going to have one. Dear colleagues, we continue. The work, and I suppose that we see and hear everyone. We can see and hear each other pretty well. Dear colleagues, I raise the question of awarding Benson, Izabel, Nazikhovna the degree of candidate economic sciences in scientific major 521 economic theory for open roll call. I want to emphasize that by voting for, each member of the Dissertation Council agrees that Clause 11 of the order has not been violated by the applicant. Point 11 means, in the thesis, the applicant for scientific degree is obliged to refer to the author or the source of borrowing the material individual results. When using in the thesis the results of scientific works performed by the applicant for scientific degree personally or in co-authorship, the applicant for scientific degree is obliged to note this circumstance in the dissertation. I remind you that the decision of the Dissertation Council on the issue is considered positive, with more than half, but not less than 3 members of the Dissertation Council voted for it, in accordance with paragraph 23 of the order. So now we move into the voting procedure. Member of the Council, Dissertation. I vote for, thank you. Council Member Salicheva Tamara Alexeyevna. I vote for. Clause 11 was not violated. Council Member Lipinskas Arunas. I vote for. Member of the Council Piotr Lemeshchenko. I vote for. I, the Chairman of the Council, Pakhomova Nadezhda Viktorovna. I vote for. Dear colleagues, we have received unanimous vote results. Out of 5 members, 5 people voted for. Against none, abstained none. The decision awarding Benson, Izabel, Nazikhovna the degree of candidate of economic sciences in scientific major 521 economic theory is accepted. Unanimously accepted. I'd like to congratulate the applicant and the scientific advisor and I give the floor to the applicant. I would like to express great gratitude for your time, for your review of my work, for very interesting offers and suggestions. I cannot but agree when answering your remarks. I was able to systematize the material and to get to know something new, and I got pleasure from it, from the process itself. Thank you very much once again. It was extremely pleasant to have it today. I'm sure that you want to thank your scientific advisor, first of all. And I agree with scientific advisor. Try to find the opportunity to work with State University. So try to find the opportunity to continue working at university. You have huge potential. So you should think about the doctoral degree. And maybe after receiving a doctoral degree, you will find work at university much more attractive. We declare the meeting of the Council closed. Please turn off the live broadcast. Thank you for participation.